Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Rabbi Silber's shir on the Sefer Shemot. As usual, I have invited everyone to join as a panelist. I'll send an invitation again, but this means that you'll be able to unmute when we pause for questions. And in between those moments, you can put any questions in the chat, and I'll make sure that they get to Rabbi Silber. And between those moments, if you could keep muted, and it would be great if you could let us see your faces. That's always makes these Zoom meetings a little bit nicer. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Rabbi Silber.
Thank you very much. Okay, so this is the we continue our Sunday class. Last night the clocks were changed in the United States, so I know it feels like 9 o'clock, but it actually is 10 o'clock. Okay, so we're still in the middle of Moshe's conversation with God, who is chosen Moshe to go back to Egypt and to take the people out of Egypt, the suffering people out of Egypt. And as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, Moshe doesn't seem to be overly excited about the prospect. He has several arguments or claims that he feels demonstrate he's not the right person for the job. Each time he makes this claim, there's a divine response. So we're now in chapter 4 already, part of the same speech. And Moshe has said they won't believe me, after God had said earlier they will believe you. So we discussed that a bit, how to resolve that contradiction, as it were. In any event, God gives Moshe some signs, otot. And we're in chapter 4, and there are 2 signs that are given. The first sign is that his staff, he throws it to the ground, and the staff becomes a nachash, snake. And the second sign, which begins in verse number 6, to put his hand into your bosom, he pulls it out, and it's leprous. When he puts his hand back, the hand has been healed back to the way it was beforehand. And God says to Moshe in the 8th pasuk, "Vayom lo yaminu lecha, lo yishmu kol ha'ot harishon, ve'aminu kol ha'ot acharon." If they won't believe the first sign, then they'll believe the second sign. Literally, acharon, the last sign. However, so we must take note of the fact that the 2 signs that Moshe has given, we discussed it a bit last week. In the first sign, his staff turns into a snake. In the second time, he turns into a leper. Those are hardly, in terms of what it represents, certainly one can read into this, given the fact that these are the 2 signs, that God's response to Moshe is not necessarily a joyous one. In other words, as I said from the outset, Moshe is the only candidate for the job. There's only one person for the job, and that means that he is in a good negotiating position, because Joe, just 1 second, please. Just 1 second. Tova? Hello? All right. Someone try to get into the class. Okay, in any event, so again, the signs, I would say, turning into a leper or the staff turning into a snake might suggest that God was not happy with Moshe's latest problem that he brings up. Moshe keeps on raising these problems, and God each time parries it as some kind of a response. In any event, the signs that we're talking about over here, just to state the obvious, these are signs for the people. These are not signs for the Egyptians. These are signs to demonstrate that he is a genuine emissary from God. Later in the Chumash, in the book of Devarim, when it talks about a prophet, how do you know someone's actually a prophet or not? and the Torah speaks about the prophet giving signs. That's an interesting discussion. I'm not going to have that now, but so this would fall into that general category of demonstrating, confirming that you are in fact a prophet by your ability to give signs. So these are the two signs, the first sign and the second sign. And if we just continue along in verse number 9, interesting verse, if you don't believe these two signs, and they won't heed you, they won't obey what you say, they'll suspect that you're not a true prophet. Now we have a third sign. What's the third sign? Take some water out of the Nile, out of the Ya'ar, throw it to the ground, and the water will turn into blood. Now, this is an extremely interesting sign. If you don't believe the first two signs, there's a third sign, but the third sign of the waters of the Nile turning to blood, when we think of that, call it a sign, or that event, all of us certainly connected to the first of the 10 plagues. Dam is the first plague. So it's interesting that over here, turning the water into blood, yes, it was taken out of the Nile, thrown to the ground, it turns to blood, but that's not a sign for the Egyptians. That's a sign for Bnei Israel. Now, of course, the turning of the Nile waters into blood, we know that in the very first chapter, Pharaoh had commanded the Egyptians to throw the Israelite boys into the Nile. So one might say that the Nile was filled with Jewish blood. And clearly this sign of, in this case, being given to the people is a recognition of the fact that this is what has been happening, to put it out there. And furthermore, it also suggests that Moshe, who's coming as God's emissary, has determined to avenge that blood. But let's just want to remind ourselves that this sign over here, as it's described in the Torah, is not a sign for Mitzrayim. In case the Israelites won't believe in you, this is the sign. So this Dam sign is an interesting one. We'll come back to it later, because the blood plays a very central role in this whole first half of the book of Exodus, and we will see this today, I think, as well, a little bit later on. In any event, now he has the signs, and so you would think at this point, finally, Moshe is going to go on the mission, but no. We're up to the 10th pasuk. Vayomer Moshe el Hashem bi Adonai. Lo ish dvarim anochi. Gam mitzmo, gam mishoshom, gam me'oz davrecha lavdecha. Ki chavad peh uchvad lashon anochi. Now Moshe has a different problem. Moshe says, I'm not fit for the job. Please my Lord, or be Adonai. I know it's my fault. Be ha'avon. The deficiency is with me. It's not you. It's all about me. I'm not a man of words, says Moshe. Lish devarim anochi, and I never was. I was never a speaker. I was never a talker. I am kvad peh ukvad lashon. Somehow, kvad peh and kvad lashon, here they translate, in this particular translation, slow of speech and slow of tongue, literally heavy. Words don't come easily to me. That's what he's saying. I'm not a good speaker. Now, again, that lends itself to more than one possible interpretation, that I'm not a good speaker. One could be simply that he has trouble speaking. He slurs his words, maybe he stutters a lot. He's not clear when he speaks, some kind of deficiency, or it could mean something else, that I'm not, that when it comes to language, I'm not a good speaker. I don't have the right phraseology. One might even say we don't speak the same language. Remember, Moshe grows up in the larger court of Pharaoh. His mother is Pharaoh's daughter. He grows up as an Egyptian. In chapter 2, when the daughters of Reuel see him, they tell their father, an Egyptian man saved us, Ish Mitzri. So it could also mean, and this is an important point in general, we don't talk the same language. That is, whether it means he also has some kind of speech defect, deficiency, or whatever. But basically, Moshe and people don't speak the same language. And I mean that in a very profound way. They don't speak the same language. He's not one of the people. He never was one of the people, and he never will be one of the people. So he said, basically, it's a problem of how do you relate to these people. It could also be as well that he actually he's not a talker. That's what he says. You want me to be your emissary to speak to Paro, to speak to the people. I'm not the right guy. You need a talker, and I'm not a talker. That's what Moshe is saying, and that has many different possible meanings, both here and as the story proceeds. It's funny when we think of Moshe. Moshe says, "I'm not a good talker." When we think of Moshe throughout his career in the Chumash, story of the golden calf, the story of the spies, he is the most eloquent defender of the Jewish people that ever existed. And at this point, he says, "I'm not really the right guy because I have some kind of either speech defect, or not facility with the language, or facility or problems with communicating with the people. I'm not the right guy." That's what Moshe says. That's not me. I'm not a man of words, he says. That's another reason that he should not go. And then we have God's response. Then I'll stop and take any comments or questions. Vayomer Hashem Elav, Misam Pelo Adam, O Mi Yosum Ilaim, O Cheresh, O Pikeach, O Iver, Alo Anochi Hashem, V'atolech, V'anochi Ayem Picha, V'oreiticha Asher Tidaber. So God's response in the 11th and 12th pasuk is, who was the one, again, who was the one who fashions speech? Who gives a person the ability to speak? Is it not I, says God? Who makes someone, who prevents someone from speaking, dumb, or obscene? It's me. And therefore what? Therefore, says God, go, and I will tell you, as you speak, I will instruct you what to say. So that sounds like his problem isn't just he doesn't pronounce the words well, he's not facile with speech. He doesn't know how to formulate the ideas in a very good way, which God seems to be responding. Don't worry about that. I'm the master of speech. I'm the creator of speech, and I will tell you I will instruct you what to say. That's certainly one way to read it. I wanted to make a different suggestion, though, about what God is saying over here, and I think it's important in terms of what follows. But the question could be asked. Let's assume Moshe has some kind of serious speech problem. Why does God choose Moshe? Moshe said, "Lo ish devarim anochi." I'm not a man of words, and certainly seems to be the case when we think about Moshe's career. And what stands out in the first three stories about Moshe, he's not a man of words. I mean, in the three of the stories, namely, intervening when he sees the Egyptian beating the Israelite, tries to intervene when the two Jews are fighting, and the 7 daughters of the priest of Midian, he intervenes and takes their side, rises and redeems them. In only one of the 3 stories does he actually speak. In 2 of the 3 stories, he says nothing whatsoever. He acts. So I believe that actually one way to read this is, what Moshe is saying is, I'm not a man of words. And one way to read God's response is, listen, if I wanted a man of words, I wouldn't choose you. I don't want a man of words. That's not my thing. I want a man of action. I'll tell you what to say. But you're not being chosen because because you're a great debater or a great speaker, a great orator. That's not why I'm choosing you. I'm choosing you, among other reasons, because I want someone who actually acts, someone who feels compelled to act, no matter what the circumstances. I don't want an ish devarim. I'm not interested in a talker here. That's why I want you. That's the answer. As far as speech is concerned, who has created speech if not me? So that's, I think, one way to read the story. I think that's certainly a possible interpretation. At which point now, finally, God has parried all of Moshe's issues or his arguments. and we'll come to the next argument in a minute. Before we continue, just want to stop for a moment. Does anybody have any comments or questions at this point?
Yes, I have a comment. It's interesting that when Moshe protests that he is not a man of speech, he multiplies words. He could have said this so much clearly, so much more directly, with so many fewer words. And he actually is speaking in a very expansive way.
Right, that might lend itself to the interpretation that, right, that's why I was pushing, among other things, something which I'm not sure is the best interpretation here, but it's certainly true in general, which is that Moshe is never one of the people. We're coming here in this little vignette over here we're coming to, the Torah will present us with Moshe and Aaron, and that actually is a very interesting topic to talk about, and we will talk about it, because Israel has two leaders. There's Moshe, and then his brother Aaron is going to join him. And we see that at different points in the Chumash, Moshe and Aaron seem to be presented differently. Are they sort of equal partners? Is Aaron sort of his assistant? Is Aaron a last resort? God didn't want Aaron, or no, maybe Aaron is really the right person for the job together with Moshe. Those are questions that will come up. But in any event, we'll see this, because the point is that when you think about Moshe and Aaron more globally in the Chumash, it's pretty clear that Aaron is actually one of the people, and Moshe's not. And these are, since you raised this question implicitly about his speech, I just wanted to say something about, we're going to come to it in a moment, but I'll say something right now about Moshe and Aaron, that they have completely two different models of leadership. When Moshe represents in the Chumash, I think, and he says it over here, he's not one of the guys. That's not Moshe. He doesn't really relate to the people on that level. He's going to be their teacher, but he's not a guy who's going to stand outside one day, when the synagogue is completed, stand outside and schmooze with the people for 30 minutes. That's not him. He's not a schmoozer. He basically much more comfortable standing alone with God than he is with the people. So that's Moshe. And because of that, or related to that, he's not a person who's prone to make excuses for the people. And that will come out very forcefully in a story that we read recently in the synagogue, but one that is central to the book of Shemot, one of the central stories of the Bible, actually, the story of the golden calf. There you have, in that story, these two leaders who represent two radically different ideas of what it means to be a leader. Because when Moshe comes down that mountain and he sees the people dancing around the golden calf, and he approaches his brother and he says to his brother, what did the people do to you to make you do such a thing? What is this? You make them a golden calf? What did they do? And to which Aaron gives a very instructive answer. Atoya data et ki barahu. You know the way these people are. They're in a bad way. Now, we're not going to get to all the details of that. If we ever get someday to the golden calf story again, we'll spend a fair amount of time on that. But his point is, these are who these people are. And Aaron seems, in the story of the golden calf, to try to delay them. He makes a golden calf, come back tomorrow. He's hoping tomorrow's a Chag Lashem. So basically, you deal with the people where they are, and you try and make the best of a very bad situation. That's what Aaron says. We'll get someday to the details of it. That's one kind of leadership. One kind of leadership is, you know where the people are, and you want to move them, a little bit forward all the time. That's one model of leadership. And I've heard about that model of leadership from many different sources over many years. I've heard different synagogue rabbis, quite successful ones, I would say straight out, you got to know where the people are, and you want to move them a little bit forward at a time, small victories, as it were, and that's how you move people forward. And that's I call the leadership. That's Aaron HaKohen. That's his model. I know where they are. This is who they are. They're not in a good place, so I had to give into it. They just try to stall them, to delay it, to try to recast it in some sense. But Moshe will have nothing of that. Moshe is not interested in where they are. He has zero interest in that. Moshe saw the people kifora. The people were wild. They lost control. Aaron had enabled it as a disgrace in front of their enemies. From Moshe's standpoint, that's not leadership. Moshe's position is you set the bar at a certain height, and you hope that someday people may get there. They may get there in a week. They may get there in a year. They may get there in 20 years, or maybe their children or grandchildren somehow will get there. But that's where you set the bar. And the idea that that's where they are, that statement is not in Moshe's vocabulary. He doesn't know from that. There's only one way, which is the right way. You set the bar high, and you hope that people will someday come to understand what you're trying to teach them. So I would say these are two radically different kinds of leadership. And the truth of the matter is, I think it's fair to say that we need both types. We need people that set the bar high, and people will struggle to get there. Sometimes people don't even understand what they've taught us until 2, 3, 5 generations later. Begin to understand what they were actually saying. And that's very important. On the other hand, to deal with the reality on the ground, there's a strong argument to be made for that as well. If you just try to set the bar too high, you lose them altogether. And the other way, at least, you can move them forward to some extent. So this is the leadership of Moshe and the leadership of Aaron, and they actually can work together. They are partners, but at the end of the day, they have very different conceptions of what it means to lead. I think we should keep this in mind as we look at the various stories of Moshe and Aaron. And different texts of the Bible present them very differently. In the story over here, I think it's fair to say that Aaron was not God's first choice. It's only after Moshe complains that God will send Aaron to assist. But in other places in the Bible, Moshe and Aaron are presented as kind of almost as equal partners. We say in our prayer service on Friday, Moshe v'Aaron b'choanav u'shmuel b'karei shemo. Moshe and Aaron are mentioned together. They're God's chosen. They're God's leaders, together with Samuel. They cry out to God, and God responds. So let's bear this in mind as we go through these stories of Sefer Shemot, of redemption, and also how Aaron specifically is portrayed within different biblical texts. Does anybody else have something to add over here?
I thought that Moshe was specifically picked because he had been raised in the palace, that he didn't have the slave mentality. You needed to have somebody who was not, who was other, who had not had that experience, who had a sense of self, and could approach Paro not as somebody downtrodden and who had this background of being a slave. I think that was also very important, to pick somebody like that.
That's certainly possible. That is true. Even though Moshe is thrown into the river, symbolically, so he goes through the same kind of experience that others have gone through. But your point is certainly well taken, that he actually doesn't grow up as a slave. Yes, he is wanted. He's on the most wanted list. He has to run away, but it's very true. Again, so that's an interesting point, and I think something to think about, that he actually was never really a slave, and maybe for that reason he's able to, and other reasons we had expressed, he's able to have a different perspective on what's actually going on. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Moshe, anyway, at this point, the reader believes, having that, if we never read it before, that finally God has responded to all of Moshe's complaints, as it were. Now we come to verse number 13. This is a rather shocking verse. Vayomer bi Adonai, shulach na biyad tishlach. At the end of all the complaints have been met, have been responded to, and now we have this little verse. Please God, shlach na biyad tishlach, send biyad tishlach, send the one who you would send. It could mean send the one who you've sent in the past. That's one opinion. Or shlach na biyad tishlach means send anybody else. In other words, thank you very much I appreciate the offer. I'm very honored that you chose me. I have raised a few questions, and you've answered very well. So I would say the following: get somebody else. He doesn't want to do it, which really is interesting because, as I mentioned before, sometimes you talk to somebody and they say, "I'm not interested," and you raise a whole bunch of issues and you respond to all the issues. At the end of all your responses, "I'm not interested," which means that what's bothering them is something else. What's really bothering them is not anything they've said. There's something else they're not saying, which is what is bothering them. And it strikes me that in this particular case, it's easy to understand why he might not want to go back. Two reasons. He's very happy where he is. He has the priest of Midian, his father-in-law, whom he actually respects. And they seem to be very similar. They're very obsessed with justice. Ish mitzri hitzilanu. So that's one thing. He's got a wife, he's got kids, he's got a job, he's got somebody he really likes, where he is now. And back at Mitzrayim, his experience with the fellow Jews is they're the ones that directly or indirectly put his life in danger and forced him to flee. When he tried to intervene and help out, who made you the boss? Who made you the chief? Now he's supposed to go back and announce, "Here I am, I'm the chief." They told him they don't want him. So that probably is, or well, maybe the real reason he doesn't want to go. That's the real reason. So after all the complaints have been registered and responded to, shalach na biyad tishlach, send somebody else, anybody else maybe. So this is it. So this is the real reason then. Now we have God's response, which is interesting. Vayicharaf Hashem ben Moshe. God got angry. It doesn't say God was angry before, because Moshe raised legitimate questions. I'm not a speaker. They don't know me. How would they know I'm telling the truth? All these problems. But in this case, it becomes clear I don't want to go. And that's not a choice. And I would add, he already said hineni in the beginning. So in a certain sense, he's already agreed to go. So God is angry. Vayicharaf Hashem ben Moshe. Vayomer. And here we have Aaron. Halo Aaron achicha halevi. Yodati ki daber yedaberhu. V'gam hinehu yotzei lekrotecha v'roacha v'samach b'libo. God said, God was angry. God said, your Aaron, your brother, the Levi. Interesting that God calls Aaron the Levi. Moshe is also a Levi. It's from the tribe of Levi. The genealogy will be given in chapter 6. But Levi has another meaning. A Levi, l'lavot, means to accompany. Your brother Aaron, I would say Aaron, the Levite, the accompanist. And here what God seems to be saying is, I'm going to get somebody else, but not instead of you. I'm going to get somebody else to assist you. The Levi is sort of the assistant, the accompanist. You need an accompanist. Aaron, your brother, will accompany you. Now we have Yodati ki daber yedaberhu. And the question is how to read those words. I know that he's a good talker. He's a good speaker. The question is, again, when you're reading the text, we don't know how it's inflected. I mean, one way to read it, I put this out as a possibility. Okay, your brother Aaron can help you. He's a good talker. That is to say, if I wanted a talker, I could have chosen him in the first place. I don't want a talker. But okay, what can I do? You're the guy for the job. You keep turning me down. You keep raising one complaint after the next. So your brother's going to help you. He's the Levi. He's the accompanist. He can talk. And not only that, he's anxious for the job. He's going to come out to greet you. When he sees you, he'll be very happy. And it's not clear why will he be happy? He's happy just to see you. Has he been told by God to go there? The text doesn't tell us. But I think 2 points. First of all, the idea that Moshe and Aaron together form a team, okay? This team is going to lead Israel out of Egypt. That underscores a theme that I had brought up earlier, last week, 2 weeks ago, about brothers in the book of Shemot. It's all about siblings over here. So Moshe is going to redeem Israel together with his brother. Remember, his sister was watching over him. The sister is the one who runs down and gets Moshe, the baby, to be brought back to his natural mother. So whereas in Sefer Bereshit, brothers were very problematic, in this book it seems like we have a much more optimistic view about brothers. And the fact that Aaron, Moshe's brother, is going to be his assistant, that's actually an important point. And he's happy to do it. He'll be happy to see you. He likes, they get along well. He'll be happy for you, maybe happy that you've been chosen. And God continues, V'dibarta elav, v'samta t'advarim b'fiv, v'yonochi ayem picho v'yimpiu, v'horei ti etchem et asher ta'asun. So God says to Moshe, he'll do the talk. You'll tell him what to say. You give him the general sense, the general ideas. I will guide you and him, and I will tell you what to do. And the next verse is very striking. He will speak for you to the people. He's your representative. He will be your mouthpiece, and you will be for him an Elohim. You will play the role of God. It's interesting that one might even hear in this a bit of anger on God's part. God said, I thought we'd work it this way. I'm God, and you're my mouthpiece. It's since you reject what I want, so we'll do it a little differently. You'll be God. You stand in for me, and he will be your mouthpiece. I'm going to assist you. But that's the dynamic over here. What is clear from these psukim is that it's not exactly an equal partnership. It's Moshe with his Levi, with his accompanist. Aaron is to accompany. You will tell him what to say. I will help you, and then he's going to express your ideas. He'll be he'll be your prophet, as it were. Later on, the Torah will call Aaron Moses' prophet. So the language is very striking, and it underscores the fact that this is not what God's initial plan was. God's initial plan was, I'm God and you are my prophet. But the way it's playing out in the story, as we'll see a little later as well, Moshe is playing God and Aaron is Moshe's prophet. That wasn't God's initial intention, and we understand why God might not be so happy with this arrangement. But God has agreed to do it. And finally, and take this staff with you in your hand, with which you will perform the signs. Now, what signs are we talking about? So the commentaries are all bothered by this verse. Because after all, Moshe was given 3 signs for the people, right? The first was throw down the staff, and the staff will turn into a snake. And then you pick the staff up and it turns back into a staff. The second sign was put your hand in your bosom and it becomes leprous. Put it back and it becomes healed. And the third sign was take water out of the Nile, throw it to the ground, it becomes blood. But only one of those 3 signs is performed with the staff. Only the first sign. So what does it mean? Take the staff with you, with which you will do the signs, plural. But only one of the signs is done with the staff. That's a problem that bothered the commentaries, and it bothered the Medrash as well. And what the Medrash says, the staff, Medrash has different solutions, but the basic idea is that what it's talking about is not necessarily the signs that Moshe will do before his own people, but rather here there's a hint at the fact that later with these plagues, that the Mata will be useful in terms of some of the plagues. The Medrash says that that on the staff itself there were written letters, sort of, a kind of hinting at what plagues are going to happen. Medrash claims, and this is found in the Passover Haggadah, that on the staff itself it said Tzach Adash Ba'achav, the 10 plagues. They're written in on the staff. In fact, the Haggadah, we had to Otod, right? We had to Otod at Moftim, Otod ze Amate. And they quote this verse, Amate Hazeh Tikach Biyodecha Asher Taseh Bo Otod. That somehow the staff that's being referred to over here is not so much the signs for the people, but there's God looking forward to the fact that God already told Moshe that I'm going to bring my punishment upon Paro, my miracles, my wonders, and only after all of that will he permit you to leave. So this is the end of the final. This is the end of this piece of it, presumably. Moshe finally has no response. God has given in to Moshe in two ways. A, you don't go alone. Someone else will do the talking for you. You have an assistant. That's number one. And number two, you go with the staff. You go as a magician, as it were. I thought you would go as my representative, not a magician. But since you put up such a opposition to me, I'm going to send you as a magician. That is, I would say, as some extent as an Egyptian, because Egypt is a place of magic, as we'll see. Pharaoh has his Khartoumim, his magicians. So you have to initially go there on that level. You have to demonstrate your credibility by performing signs as a good Egyptian magician might do. But that was not God's initial plan. God's initial plan was go with faith, and I will be with you. But Moshe has resisted. Okay, so this is the end of this long conversation between Moshe and God. Bottom line, Moshe finally has agreed to go. In a moment, we'll start the next story. Moshe's departing from his father-in-law, and if we get to it, the famous scene on the way back, where God seeks to kill Moshe, one of the more enigmatic stories of the Bible. But before he continues, anybody want to add or suggest or question anything to this point? If not, we'll continue with the next pasuk, which is the next story. Okay.
I always love the Rashi of V'ra'acha v'samach b'libo, that if Aaron knew that this would be written, he would have reacted differently.
Right.
It just is a great midrash that about how we behave, and if we knew things would be written down, would we behave differently?
Right. I think the Midrash has several examples of that. This is one of them. There's other. Remember the others,
Right.
Have 2 or 3 other examples as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the idea that they get along, this is I know we get along. He's going to be happy for you, which is not a small thing, because we know that in Sefer Breshit, brothers, starting with the first set of brothers, the whole book's about animosity between brothers: Cain and Hevel, Yishmael and Yitzchak, Yaakov and Esav, certainly Yosef and the brothers. And here in the new book, there's a very different feeling about brothers. They seem to be getting along just fine. Moshe's brother, Moshe's sister, they're looking out for him, they're caring about him, they're happy for him, etc. So this is a very different end. Remember that Moshe was defined by God as the brother of his fellow Jews. You're brothers. You have the same father, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moshe is going back to redeem his brothers. That's a very important point. Okay, let's continue with verse number 20. Verse number 18. By Yelech Moshe. Now Moshe, fine. Moshe has accepted all this. He was out in the desert the whole time. By Yelech Moshe. By Yoshev o Yeter Chodno. He goes back to his father, where he is called Yeter. Another name, Yeter, Yitro, essentially the same idea. As I mentioned, superfluous. He went back to Mr. Extra, Mr. Superfluous. Vayomalo, El Chana v'yashuva el achai asher b'Mitzrayim v'yareha odam chayim. Vayomer Yitro Moshe leich l'shalom. That's a very, very interesting verse, because Moshe was told by God to go back to Egypt to redeem his people. When you read verse number 18, there is no sense, I think, that Moshe is conveying that to Yitro. What he seems to be saying is, look, I haven't been back in Egypt. I got a whole family back there. My brothers, that's to say my family. That's what Yitro would hear, brothers, my mishpacha. I haven't seen them in a long time. It's difficult. I want to go back home and see how they're doing. Are they still alive? What's happening? Yitro says to Moshe, go in peace. You would never in a million years think that Moshe is leaving you to redeem the people of Israel. Sounds like he's going on a 2 or 3 week vacation back to the home, the old country, to visit the family. In other words, already in the way Moshe talks to Yitro, he's already broken from Yitro in some sense. He's not straight with him. He's not fully honest with him. It's very misleading to see if my brothers are still. Of course, the reader of this verse, when you read this pasuk, V'yareh ha'odam chayim, and we all remember the verses in the book of Breshit, like Yaakov and Yosef, Od Avi Chai, Od Yosef Chai. There it's about the father and the son, not the brothers. But over here, as I mentioned before, it's about the brothers. Od Achinu Chai, I would say. That's the question. And Yitro doesn't know what Moshe is. Go in peace. Why not? You want to visit your mishpacha? That's fine. That's what it sounds like. And now we have, once again, God is speaking to Moshe, this time not in the desert, where Moshe was spoken to before at the sneh, but this is inside Midian. He's come back to Yitro. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe b'Midyan, lech shuv Mitzrayim, ki metu kol ha'anoshim hamavakshim et nafshecha. God says to Moshe, go back to Egypt. And God adds, the people that sought your life have all died. In other words, it's safe to go back. It's safe to go back. The people that sought to kill you, it probably includes the Pharaoh, the new one that emerged after the death of Joseph and whatever, one who didn't know Joseph. He's died, together with his entourage. So God says to Moshe, it's safe now to return. In other words, perhaps what God has gotten from Moshe is an agreement to go. But the question is, when do you go? And for how long? And now God adds a detail. This is it. The coast is clear. You can go back and you can start doing your work to take the children of Israel out of Egypt. This is a story, by the way, just without getting into this now. But this particular story of Moshe going back to Mitzrayim to redeem the people, and this is not surprising, is one of these foundational stories that appears elsewhere in the Bible much later. Maybe someday we'll deal with that. It's an interesting topic, how some of the later stories play off the story over here. The parallel, but in some sense, opposite stories. But in any event, this is the story over here. It's now safe to go. So that Moshe is given the charge. It's safe to go. And now we have the next, just 1 second, the next pasuk, Vayikach Moshe et ishto v'et banav, vayarkiveim al hachamar, vayoshev arta Mitzrayim, Vayikach Moshe et mateh Elohim biyado. In this pasuk, so here it says only in verse number 20 that Moshe took his wife and his children. He mounted them on the transport, Chamar, and he headed back to the land of Egypt, and he took with him the staff of the rod of God. In other words, at this point, because initially when he spoke to Yitro, 2 verses earlier, he didn't talk about the wife and the kids. He said, I want to visit my brothers, see if they're still alive. And one might have the impression that he was going to go by himself. But in this verse, in verse number 20, it says Moshe took his wife and his children, and together with the staff. So it sounds like from this verse that whatever he told to Yitro back in verse number 18, I want to see if my brothers are alive. But here it sounds like he's moving back to Egypt. He's taking the wife, he's taking the children. And as I think the Ramban points out, if you're going to redeem the people who have been suffering, it makes a lot more sense to come with the family and to say, I cast my lot with you, as opposed to, the wife and the kids are living back in some other country. I'm coming by myself. No, Moshe brings the wife, the children, the whole mishpacha, to demonstrate that he's with them completely. He's not just living elsewhere and visiting or something like this. No, he has a stake in it the same way they do. But in any event, the wife and the children are mentioned here in verse number 20 and not in 18. I think it's very striking. And because God had said the coast is clear. All those that seek your life, all the people who seek your life, they've died. And now Moshe sets out and he brings the staff with him, the mateh with which he will perform the miracles. So this is really it. He's determined to go. He has his instructions. And now, I'll stop in a minute, take comments or questions, but now, suddenly, God adds a few more details to Moshe that he was not told before, very strikingly. And we'll get to that in 1 minute. Before we continue, someone had a comment to make?
I think it's interesting. Oh.
Go ahead.
Okay, it's interesting that the way that he speaks to Yitro is similar to the way that he's initially instructed to speak to Paro, right? We're just going for 3 days Lisboa, meaning not exactly being honest because he's already been othered and he's already not the person who's going to be read in.
Well, first of all, I don't think that I think when they tell Paro they're going to go for 3 days, they actually mean it. We'll get to that.
Okay.
I don't think they intend to run away. I'm 100% sure they don't intend to run away. They do intend to leave later. But going into the desert for 3 days to serve God is a prerequisite to leaving. You can't leave Mitzrayim until you have all served God together. That is clear in the Chumash. And just to mention this, not to give everything away, but the fact of the matter is that Paro never lets them go into the desert for 3 days to serve God. But at the end of the day, they do serve God together, not in the desert, within the land of Egypt. That's chapter 12 of this book. That's the Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach is the sacrifice they had wanted to bring outside Egypt, which was because it wasn't possible to do it in Egypt, because the Egyptians won't allow us to do it. That is true now. But after 9 plagues have come, the Egyptians are willing to allow them to do it. And that's the Korban Pesach. That's a prerequisite. You can't leave Mitzrayim until you've served God together. That's a critical piece of the story, but we'll get back to that. But in any event, but over here, Moshe certainly was not honest with Yitro, not completely honest. That's certain. Anybody else for comment?
Yes, it seems that Moshe is undergoing a certain degree of psychological development in that before he was a son, basically, to Israel. And here, there's a progression. God says to him, you will be like God to your brother. So he takes the role of the father toward his brother, and his brother is happy to come to him. And then after that, he has the freedom to leave his father-in-law. And then the posuk here, Vayikach Moshe es ishtoi, that he became a head of a family as a result of this. And also, Vayikach es hamate olakim v'yodai, he seized the role of God. V'yodai, he took it into his hands, the matter of being the leader, the father.
I agree. There's certainly seems to be a change, and things will continue to develop. He's still at the beginning of his career, but he's moved into he's taken on this great responsibility, and therefore that with the responsibility comes a certain amount of necessary growth and change. That's no question. He has a long way to go still, but as we will see. But now God will throw a couple of surprises coming up now in the next few verses, to put it mildly. Vayom Hashem Moshe.
But Rabbi Silber,
Yes.
the yeter part being superfluous, this is of course something of an insult that you have to heed, be careful whom you're listening to. It's really,
Oh, right. Yeter and Yitro are all the same name. Yitro is superfluous already in chapter 3 because God says to Moshe, you have to save your brothers. Moshe loves Yitro, but Yitro is not our brother. He's the priest of Midian. And that's the point. Moshe only has one friend in the Bible. It's Yitro. And he has to leave his friend because his friend is not a brother. His job is to save his brothers. That's his task. He loves Yitro. Yitro's great. Yitro comes later, gives all kinds of advice. But at the end of the day, he's a Midianite priest. Okay, he's a great friend of Israel, but that's not Moshe's task in life. And it's a task that Moshe has grudgingly accepted, I would say. That's what's been chosen for him, and that's what he's going to do. And that's his job, with all the stuff that comes with it, including dying in the desert, not entering the land, and all the difficulties with his people over 40 years. But that's the job that he's been given, and that's his task, and he does it very well. And when he wants to enter the land, God says, no, that's not your job. Your job has been completed. Your job was to move them out of Egypt to set them up to go into the land. But only the next generation will possess the land, not the third generation, the fourth generation, and you are a third generation person. That's the story. Is it a tragedy? From one perspective, maybe yes, but I'm not sure the Chumash would see it as a tragedy. You do what you're told to do. But we'll see all this. How this all plays out. In any event, now God says to Moshe now in this puzzle, Vayom Hashem Moshe, L'lechtecho ashuv Mitzrayma, Ri'ei kol hamoftim asher samti biyodecha, v'asitam l'fnei Paro, v'ani achazek et libo, v'lo yishalach et ha'am. So God repeats this to Moshe. This is not a small point. Moshe's on the way down, and God says to Moshe, let me explain something to you. I know you heard this before, but I'm not sure it registered with you. And as we'll see, it didn't register. You're going to go to Paro, and he's not going to listen to you. Ani achazek et libo. I will harden his heart. We'll deal with the hardening of the heart some other time. But the fact of the matter is, he's not going to listen. He's not going to send the people. I'm telling you what's going to happen. I know you have your staff with all the otot on it, all the plagues, but he's not going to listen. And now we tell you further. V'yamatoel Paro, Ko Amar Hashem, and at that you will say to Paro, this is what God has said. Ko Amar Hashem, B'ni B'chori Yisrael. Israel is my firstborn child. And therefore, the next verse, V'omar Elecha, and I said to you, Shalach et ami v'yavdeni. I told you, says Moshe, that God has said, send my child. Israel is my child. Send my child to serve me. Since you have refused, because you refuse to let God's eldest child, serve God, in response to that, God is going to kill your eldest child. Now, this picture, this scene over here, Moshe has grudgingly agreed to go back to Egypt to save his people. And there's a small detail that God left out. Oh, by the way, Moshe's already in transit, you know. By the way, a little detail I forgot to mention to you. With all the signs and everything, it's not going to work. And Paro's going to be very obstinate. And you're going to tell him at that point, God plans to kill your firstborn children. Now, I could see where, if that were told to Moshe in the beginning of the whole story, Moshe might have said, that's not really a message I wanted to deliver to Paro. That's not really necessarily what I would want to do. But that's what's being told over here. On the way down, this was God, it's not mentioned earlier. I want to just leave in abeyance, for future reference, these few words, Ko Amar Hashem, B'ni B'chori Yisrael, that Israel is my firstborn son. B'ni B'chori Yisrael. Let's put that aside for now and keep it in the back of our heads, because we know, by the way, that generally speaking, in the Chumash so far, the firstborn child hasn't done very well. Abraham was not the firstborn. Yitzchak is not the firstborn. And Yaakov probably isn't the firstborn either. Joseph is the firstborn to his mother. He's wholly the firstborn. Firstborn was Reuven. So the firstborn children don't have such a good track record. But in any event, clearly over here, Israel is my firstborn, and you are trying to harm my firstborn, and I'm going to harm your firstborn because you have refused to listen to me. Okay, let's leave out the question of God will harden Pharaoh's heart. That's the old problem, but leave that aside for now. So this is what Moshe is being told on the way down, a little detail over here. At some point, he's going to threaten Paro. Paro's own family will be threatened. Not just the Egyptian people, but Paro personally will be threatened. Okay. Now we have, of course, one of the strangest stories of the Bible. We'll begin it now. And it's a very, very difficult story. The facts of the story are not clear, and the idea of the story is certainly not clear. But very famous story. Very famous story. Vayhi ba'derech ba'molon. Now we're told that Moshe's headed back to Mitzrayim. He has his wife, he has the children, he's traveling down, and it came to pass. Ba'molon. Malon is called an inn, a place where one might rest or sleep, lalun. And he's traveling ba'derech. he's still on the road. He's on the road to Egypt. Vayifkeshehu Hashem, vayivakesh hamito, that God encountered him and sought to kill him. If you haven't seen this before, you sort of jump out of your seat. What? First of all, this is exceedingly strange. First of all, why does God want to kill him? Let's start with that. Why does God want to kill him? Number two, we've had 2 long chapters of negotiation between God and Moshe. God is trying every which way to pressure Moshe to go. Moshe finally agrees to go. And he's he's headed down there, and God seeks to kill him. By the way, when you read this verse, which is verse number 24, something jumps out at you when you read verse number 24, which is, if you go back a couple of verses, what?
Vayifkeshehu is, doesn't that happen with Yaakov and the Malach? Isn't that the same
No.
word used?
No, I don't think so. Let me see. Yaakov and the Malach.
When he
Yaakov and the
fights him?
Malach.
I think that's how they describe Asa.
With Esav, you have Vayifkeshehu, but not with Yaakov. No, with the Malach, you don't. No, you have it. Let's see. Vayivater Yaakov vayoveki Shima vayoveki adolot hashacha. No, you don't have Vayifkeshehu there. No, what jumps out, but Vayifkeshehu with Esav, you have it. But I mean, are you referring to something else? God said to Moshe, you can go back to Egypt. In retrospect, all the people that want to kill you have died. Anoshim. It's just a couple of verses earlier. And now you read this verse, it came to pass on the way down by an inn on the resting place, Vayifkeshehu Hashem, that God encountered Moshe, Vayivakesh hamito. In other words, yes, Moshe would say, what's going on over here? You sent me down over there. You encouraged me to go. You told me no problem. God would say, well, I said all the people that want to kill you have died, but I'm not a person, right? Ironically, no, but there's one who does want to seek your death, who's not dying, never dies, and that is God. Obviously, this verse raises a million questions, and obviously, the first question is why? And after all this struggle that God encountered with Moshe, convincing him, and now God seeks to kill Moshe. Now, of course, if God actually sought to kill Moshe, he'd be dead. So God isn't really seeking to kill him. That is to say, he has to do something, or something has to be done to enable Moshe to continue his journey. But nonetheless, something has to be done. If not, Moshe's life is in danger. Another question is why. There are 2 main approaches here to why God seeks, as it were, to kill Moshe. 2 main approaches. One is that of the Rashbam. Rashbam is a very simple approach. The Rashbam claims that this whole business of God's anger at Moshe is, the Rashbam says, if you see, when Moshe said to God, Shlach na b'yad tishlach, vayichar af Hashem b'Moshe. When after all the excuses had been met by God, and no problem, and then Moshe says, okay, get somebody else, vayichar af Hashem, that God was angry. And God's anger, says the Rashbam, it doesn't say what God was angry and therefore what. What did God do? But here you have it. In this verse, God is imperiling Moshe's life in response to Moshe's constant refusal to do the job that God had asked him or commanded him to do. So the Rashbam thinks this is a kind of punishment, as it were, or a response to the fact that Moshe had refused God's offer several different times. That's the Rashbam. Vayivakesh Hashem, vayivakesh hamito. Now, of course, if God wanted him to be killed, he'd be killed, but okay, but still has to go through this process. This is a manifestation of God's anger. That's the Rashbam. The general approach, though, is a different one. And from the context of the story, the general approach here is that for whatever reason, Moshe has gone down to Egypt. He brought with him his wife and his children, plural. Even though earlier in the Chumash it only mentioned one child being born, which was Gershom. Okay, but the second child, Eliezer, might have been born as well. But for whatever reason, Moshe has not circumcised his son or his son. Sounds like his son. For whatever reason, Moshe has not performed the mitzvah of Milah. And God's anger is that Moshe has failed to circumcise his son, and that has to change. He can't go back to Mitzrayim with the uncircumcised son. Of course, the question that raises is, why in fact did Moshe not circumcise his son? Okay, explains the anger of God, but doesn't explain the reason that Moshe did not circumcise his son. But in general, these are the two approaches to why God might have been angry, is angry with Moshe. And in the words of the Chumash, Vayivakesh Hamito. The simple, I would say the rationale, I think, would be the rationale, in my opinion, is something along these lines. Moshe has taken on the task to redeem Israel. In doing so, he's going to obviously put himself in great jeopardy. True, God has said, those that seek your life, they've died. It doesn't mean that the coast is clear. He's going to have problems with Paro. He's going to have problems with his fellow Jews. Maybe bigger problems with the fellow Jews. Who asked you? And Moshe will get involved, and in the beginning it gets worse, not better. So he's doing this at enormous risk to himself. And perhaps he feels that it's one thing to risk myself. I've been identified as the son of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm taking on the job, for better or worse, to redeem Israel. But why should my family, be put in that position? I'm married to the Midianite priest's daughter. We have 2 children, whatever their identity may be. Are they Jewish? Are they not Jewish? So the meal is a side of their Jewishness, obviously, and maybe Moshe feels I'm going to do what God commands me to do, but I don't necessarily want to imperil the rest of my family. And if that's his thinking, that doesn't sit well with God. God will insist that not just Moshe himself be committed to this task, but that the family be committed as well. And I would add something else to this, which we'll see later on. And this is actually, I think, a very important point about the story in general. It's always the question: what is the mission? What is Moshe's actual mission? His name is Moshe, which means the one that draws out, and he will take us out of Egypt. Moshe will be Moshe us out of Mitzrayim. He himself was drawn from the water, right? And that's his task. That's one way to see it. But there's another way to read the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, which is he has more than one task. He has one task to take the Jews out of Egypt, the suffering Jews out of Egypt. That's one task. But the other task is, and God made this clear, God said, someday you will come back to this place, you will serve God on this mountain. And God said to Moshe, I plan to bring them to the land of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to the land of the Canaanite, etc., to the land of milk and honey, to a good and broad land. And the question is, if that's his task, who is the audience Moshe is actually addressing? And I would argue that he addresses 2 different audiences. One is the people of his own generation, 3rd generation of suffering. That's Moshe, right? After Joseph's brothers dies, Levi dies. So there's a Kahat's generation 1 of suffering. Avram is 2, Moshe's 3. That's one thing. But actually, we, the reader, we know. Moshe doesn't know, but we know that actually the generation that leaves Egypt will never possess the land. Torah said it. The 4th generation shall return to the land. So the real audience over here for Moshe, maybe the main audience, is not the people, the parents, but the audience is actually the children. The children, because they're the 4th generation. That's the real audience over here. So the point of the story over here is Moshe has not identified his own child with his mission. And the point is that that's a problem. Because what Moshe has to come to understand is that the people you're speaking to, the real people you speak to, aren't so much the parents who were slaves in Egypt, but rather the young children who were never fully slaves in Egypt. Some, in fact, will grow up, will be born after they leave Egypt in the desert. That's the fourth generation. So Moshe has to understand the mission, a twofold mission. But the main one is to prepare the next generation to be able to enter the land. So let's bear that in mind. I think that's a very important point. And I did want to make one last point about the story. We'll continue this next week, but I want to make one point about this particular story. Moshe is in danger. Moshe is in danger. The Rashbam, remember, didn't put this in terms of Milah. For the Rashbam, for whatever reason, Milah is not the problem. But the Milah will still save him. So the Rashbam deals, what does Milah save him if that's not the problem? Leave that for now. Maybe next week we'll revisit that. But I want to make one point, which the Ibn Ezra, I found this in the Ibn Ezra, who notes this. I want to talk about this a bit, which is the next verse. Vatikach tzipora tsar. So tzipora took a tsar, a sharp instrument. Vatichrot et orlat bana. She cut off, she circumcised her son. Vatagav raglav. She touched his legs with it. Vatomer ki chatan damim atali. Now the question is, what does it mean she touched his legs with it? Whose legs? Apparently the one who's circumcised is the son. Let's say it's the Gershom, the oldest son. Right? Then she touches touches this to his legs, and she says, "You are a bridegroom of blood to me." Chatan damim atali. We'll deal with this next week. I want to make one point about this particular scene over here of the circumcision and touching to the legs and saying, "You are a bloody bridegroom to me." Now, if we assume, which I do assume, that Vatagalu Raglav are actually to Moshe's legs, not to the legs of the child. She's talking about Moshe. Chatan dami matali. I'll get to that more next week. I'll theorize what that might mean. But the idea of taking the blood and placing it on the side, the Ibn Ezra noticed this. What does it remind us of? Reminds us
the Korban Pesach.
Korban Pesach, exactly, the Korban Pesach. You're in a house, it's to slaughter the animal, and you put the blood of the animal on the lintel and on the doorposts. So there seems to be a link over here between this situation of the Milah on one hand and the story of the Korban Pesach on the other. And I mention this because I think it actually supports what I just suggested. That what the story over here is doing is, one might say, even foregrounding or preparing us for what is to happen later on. Because the point of the Korban Pesach, which is the critical event without which we can't leave Mitzrayim, but the point of the Korban Pesach is that you set this place aside, and this house is not like the other houses. The avenging angel, the destroying angel will not enter the house. But remember, in the other houses, yes, the house is in danger, but specifically the firstborn. Right? God just said to Moshe earlier, tell Paro, I'm going to kill your firstborn. So the point is that inside the house, it's the house in general that's protected by the Korban Pesach, but specifically it is the child or the children that are being protected. In other words, the link between the parents and children is central to the Korban Pesach episode. And over here, I think it's central to this strange story of the circumcision of Moshe's child that he's failed to circumcise. So she takes the blood of circumcision and she touches it to Moshe's leg, to Moshe's side, as it were. In other words, she's linking the two together. She's saying, yes, the child has to be circumcised, but it's not just about the child, it's also about the parents. The link between parents and children is what is central to the Korban Pesach, which is why in the Korban Pesach, the key word to the Korban Pesach is the word bayit. The word bayit appears over and over again. It's brought up. It's by members of the bayit. The blood is put on on the side of the bayit. The people can't leave the bayit. The bayit is central. You can't leave Mitzrayim till first you have somehow solidified the idea of bayit. So the story over here, I think the one of the functions of the story is to set up the Korban Pesach later on, and to make it clear that the two generations have to be connected. That's what Moshe, for whatever reason, has failed to do. He has failed to grasp the point that it's the linkage of generations. Because at the end of the day, we know something he doesn't know, that every person he takes out of Mitzrayim will die in the desert. Not one of them is going to make it, maybe one or two, but fundamentally, they're not going to make it. So therefore, his primary audience isn't the parents. His primary audience is actually the children. So we'll pick up on this next week. There's a lot more to say about this. And this is one of the strangest stories of the Bible, without question. Let me just stop you at this point to take comments. I did want to mention one thing here. This past week, very unfortunately, I received a message that Sarat Svatman had passed away. Probably remember Sarat Svatman taken many classes at Trisha with us, many classes. She was a distinguished professor actually in Yiddish and folk literature at Hebrew University. And for the last 10 or 12 years, she was an incredibly dedicated student, often talked up in class, said many good things, and she died very suddenly. So I was very sad to hear that. I just want to tell everybody that I miss her, and I thought she contributed a lot to our learning. May her memory be a blessing.
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
Remember her well.
Yep. And I was actually, I just got back from Israel. I was actually, the burial was on Wednesday, and I was flying back already on Wednesday back here to the States. So I wouldn't want to be at that funeral. In fact, I saw her several weeks ago. I was in Yerushalayim. I gave a class in synagogue in Jerusalem, and she was in Givat Shmuel in Ramat Gan, and she came in for the class, which she often did. She spoke up and everything, and I thought everything was fine, and got this message just a couple of days ago. Yeah. All right. Okay, I did want to mention her, and the memory should be a blessing, and she participated very much in a lot of classes. Okay, we'll continue next week with the story of Chatan Damim, and then we'll get to Moshe in Mitzrayim and his negotiation with Paro.
Rabbi Silber,
Yes.
I'm also sorry to hear it was a pleasure to listen to her every time she contributed to the class.
Yes.
A question actually. So is that why, because she only circumcised the firstborn, that why it's in the singular? That
right. That's a big question. Exactly. That's a question. So the Ramban tries to deal with this. The Ramban at one point suggests, by the way, he calls one source, that's even though it says plural, he took his children with him, banav, plural. He quotes a verse that sometimes banav, if you have only one child, that the Torah can use the plural. He has an interesting. He's bothered by this issue. Again, whatever it is, it's a good question, which the commentaries raise. But for our purposes, the point for our purposes would be first child, second child. It puts it in terms of one child. Maybe the second child was just born. Who knows? But it is a good question.
In terms of the foreboding of the Makas B'chairites, that it's only B'char that is the foretelling.
Yes,
the other is not worthy of mention.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a very excellent point. Maybe for that particular reason, it singles out the oldest child. All right, I'm going to have to stop at this point then. So look forward to. There's a lot of other stuff coming up in terms of Purim and Pesach, special classes, etc. So again, we will hopefully convene again next week.
Yes, I think details for the special shiurim are going to be coming out soon. Hoping to see some or all of you there, and of course next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a question about the schedule.
Yes.
On the morning that you are giving the Rappaport lecture, will we have class?
Yes, we will. Yes.
Yeah.
On that day, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on. But that day, there will be, this class will meet. The Rappaport lecture is at 12 o'clock, 25th Rappaport lecture. And then I teach you again afterwards. That class will be delayed to 1:30. The class I do on Mishnah. So it's be a whole full day. But this class will meet the regular time with that no change.
Yeah, that's
But
April 7th.
Right.
So
Okay.
Sarah, back anyway, from
Thank
your
you.
home.
Thank you
Thank
all.